Hi everyone! In this video series I'm going to be showing you the foundations of planet editing and how to use the SimpleRockets2 Planet Studio, a tool for the design of custom celestial bodies and stellar systems. In the first episode we looked at the Planet Studio user interface, introduced templates and discussed the celestial body and planetary system designers. In this second episode we're taking a closer look at these celestial body templates and what they're used for. But before we begin, I want to clarify a couple of points from the previous episode. The first is the location of the help information. After loading Planet Studio into the main lobby view, you can see there is this blue help button here. By pressing this, it will open up the Planet Studio help box, and you can see there's quite a lot of information here about each different aspect of the Planet Studio. It's definitely worth checking this out. Another point which I failed to mention while discussing the scaled space slider in the Celestial Body Designer is that if you leave this slider on while rebuilding the planet, the rebuild time will be considerably longer than if you leave it switched off. This is because when you leave the slider on and rebuild the planet, the scaled space files are regenerated every time. If you leave it off and only generate the scaled space when you want to look at your planet in map view or before uploading the file, you'll find that your rebuild times will be around 25% of what they would be if you left that slider on. With those 2 points out of the way, it's time to get into this episode. First, let's start to build up a picture of how planets are made. The templates are all examples of procedurally generated celestial bodies. By this we mean that they've been made using mathematical algorithms and not image textures. While we won't be covering the theory behind this in detail until a future episode, it's necessary to have a basic understanding of how procedural generation works before moving on. I am deliberately simplifying and sometimes leaving out details in some of this theory, so please bear in mind that this episode only gives the bare minimum required for basic template editing. The building blocks of procedural editing are algorithms called noises. They often mimic real-life phenomena, for example the random swirling patterns or Brownian motion in a liquid, or pixelated white noise in the background of photographs or on an old television. Let's look at an example of noise in SimpleRockets2. So you can see here I've loaded a basic planet into the Celestial Body Designer. The first thing that you'll notice is that there are several different coloured patches covering the entire surface of the planet. This pattern is made by something called noise. I've enabled a modifier called debug visualize, which shows us this noise value on a scale from purple as -1 to bright red as +1. Remember that in episode 1 we discussed the quad sphere, a mesh covering the entire celestial body. The planet is essentially a deformed cube, taking the shape of the body and its terrain. We can think of this quad sphere as a grid of points, each with spherical coordinates. Because noise is also just a grid of points with a value assigned to each point, it can be mapped onto this quad sphere, and this is how procedural terrain works. Once again, as noises are just grids of values, they can be added, subtracted, divided or multiplied by each other to form very complex results. By generating and combining noise patterns, then mapping this noise onto the coordinate grid that makes up the quad sphere, an infinite number of terrain features can be made. I won't go into detail about the different types of noise available yet, but for now just accept that there are all sorts of noises available in the Planet Studio which can be combined to form this terrain. Now that we have a basic understanding of what noises are, there are a couple more concepts that I want to introduce: noise seed and noise frequency. To explain these, let's go back to our examples of white noise and the random swirling patterns caused by dropping dye into water. We all know that the noise on a broken television changes constantly, although overall it always looks about the same, just random white noise. We can observe the same concept in Brownian motion. Dropping a set amount of dye or paint into water will always result in those same swirling patterns, but their exact shapes will always look very slightly different each time. This phenomenon is replicated by noise algorithms using something called a seed. In its simplest form, this is just a value which is put into the noise generator as an initial starting point for the calculation, and it influences the exact shapes which are generated. Changing the seed of a noise doesn't change its basic characteristics, but it randomizes the specific shape of the results. It is a bit of a strange concept, so I'll demonstrate it in a moment in Planet Studio. Before we do that, I also want to introduce another concept. This is called frequency. Now, if we go into the basic view of the terrain generation tab, so that we have a large blue button available up here, you can see that the views become a lot simpler, and we have here the noise component which are used to generate this example. By clicking on it here, you can see there is a seed input and down here a frequency input. If we increase the frequency, it will have the effect of making the noise change quicker or scaling it down. Let's see that in action. Increasing frequency to a larger value and then rebuilding. So you can see here those same shapes are being generated, but there are far more of them. It's almost as if we've zoomed out a lot. We'll alter that again just so that we get an even clearer idea of what this would look like. Now that we've examined this frequency, it's time to go back to this seed concept. There is a button which, luckily for us, can automate randomizing the seed in the Planet Studio. If we select this noise modifier here, and then press this dice symbol, which is labelled as randomizing the selected element seed, we will get a slightly different result every time. And this is a very, very good way to visualize how seed works. You can see overall the noise really isn't changing all that much, but we're getting a slight randomization applied every time. Imagine if this noise was connected to some terrain. You can see we could have hills or mountains, valleys, and every time that we randomize this, we would produce a planet with different terrain features. So let's just take a quick step back and review what we covered. First, I explained in simple terms what the noises are, remembering back to those examples of white noise or the swirling patterns called Brownian motion in a liquid. We then looked at how they're used in the Planet Studio and what noise seeds are. I then showed you the button in the Planet Studio which changes the seed of the noise, the slider which changes frequency, and introduced what that frequency slider does. Armed with this knowledge, let's move on and see how we can apply it to the templates we looked at in the first episode. So going here into the Create Planet page, let's load up the Lunar template. Right, so you can see here we've been put back into the Celestial Body Designer. So we'll zoom out a little bit to get a clearer view. Then we'll go across to the Terrain Generation tab, making sure that it is in this basic view. We are currently using basic view for a reason. This is because there are quite a lot of features which are hidden by using it, and it can be quite overwhelming to use the advanced view from the outset. Once you become a bit more experienced, and once we've covered in more detail some of the advanced procedural techniques, you'll become more familiar with how this advanced view works, but for now I'd recommend remaining in the basic view. So let's apply that theory about randomization to this template. One of the first things that you'll notice in the Basic Terrain Generation tab is that all of these items in the tree are arranged into containers, which can be collapsed or reopened, with this layered symbol, or elements. We normally call these modifiers, with this green diamond symbol beside them. As you know, when we select one of these, for example the Mars noise here, and press the randomization button, we'll expect it to produce a slightly different result every time. Now if we look over to here, you can see the frequency is quite low. In other words, not many cases of this noise are being produced across the quad sphere. So the effect of changing the seed, randomizing it, looks quite dramatic. If we went across though and changed something like, for example, a mountain's noise, from this altitude we'll probably not even notice any change. If we zoomed in closer, we might perhaps see some subtle changes occurring on the surface. But overall, this will probably give you a bit of a picture of how some things have a far more dramatic effect. Some of these noises are very subtle, others of these noises govern a huge amount of how the planet looks. Now so far what we've been doing is just randomizing individual elements. However, we can use our knowledge about modifiers and containers to randomize whole groups of elements. By clicking on this container, say for example the biome pass, and then clicking the randomize button, we see at the top the readout 3 elements were eligible and randomized. And here what's happening is all of the eligible elements within that container have been randomized. This episode has been quite heavy on the theory so far, so I think it's time to complete our discussion of the templates by covering a few less intensive topics. Let's have a brief overview of what each template is like, and also gain some understanding of how we could use each template. So you can see here that there are 12 different templates. This ranges from the first one, the blank template. Now this template, if you were to open it in the basic view, you would find it's completely empty. It'll probably become your go-to template in the future, but this series won't be looking at it in detail for a couple more episodes. Once you've become more confident in Planet Studio, you'll learn how to create your own terrain, biomes, all of the really cool procedural things we'll be looking at in the future from scratch. The next template is the gas giant. Now this one is quite different to any of the previous ones we've looked at in this series, so I'm going to open it up and we'll have a look at how its code behaves. Going across here to the Terrain Generation tab, we can see it's very different to the lunar template that we had opened a short while ago. Here there are several quite interesting noises being used. And also there's the opportunity to generate colour bands separately using different colours. A lot of this is quite well explained and intuitive. It's great fun to go in and try playing around with what all these different things do, learn a bit how all of this works. For now though, let's just demonstrate, for example, randomizing the location of the storms on the planet. We press the storm noise and then the randomization several times until we got a good result. These changes are quite subtle. In this case we only move the storms. In the cases of the gas giants, one of the more important things is changing the colours. So back in this bands modifier, if you click on the colour here, you see that you get a full colour palette available To edit the colours, you can use the HSV map or the RGB, or even input a hex key. So coming back to the templates, gas giant number 2, which is closely modelled off Eurodos in the stock system, isn't all that much different to the first gas giant. It does have the added interest of rings. We'll be looking at them in the next episode, which will be on the parametrical elements of planet editing. After that, we come to the ice template. Now this one is a very good example of how craters and large-scale noise are combined together to provide a really fascinating terrain complexity. So let's have a look at that one in a little bit more detail. Zooming out a bit here. Probably the first thing that you'll notice are these blue valley areas covering the white surface. And here we can find the noise which controls it. You can see it's low frequency. By randomizing it, we'll expect there to be very dramatic changes taking place. There you can see a couple of different extremes, or going back to something which looks a little bit closer to what the original result was. There are also craters on this celestial body. And it is possible to change the shape of the craters. By clicking on the crater shape, we come into this quite impressive looking view, which shows a cut in half cross section of the crater. By moving these points around, adjusting the tangents, adding points before or after, we can get a really interesting shape being built up here. For example, we could raise this point either manually or inputting the properties. For example, let's say setting this to a value of 0. Then we could add a key after. Adding a key after will produce one later in the time axis, which is this horizontal one. Adjusting the tangents here, and then manually setting the value to be -1. We can then rebuild to see what effect that has, and you can see over here the changes which have occurred to some of the craters. They now resemble something more like the craters on Enceladus, for example. Let's return to the templates. Here you can see the lava template. Now this is a really good example of one which mixes low frequency. You can imagine the lava valleys are low frequency noise, and high frequency, these smaller mountains covering the surface. The lunar template we've already looked at quite a few times. It's another really good example of cratered terrain. The Martian template is a little more complex. This introduces something which we haven't seen until now, which is the climate change factor. Up here underneath the biome paths, this is a constant value which we can input to change some quite interesting characteristics of the planet. Changing it from -1 to 0, we can see that water and greenery has appeared on the planet. Increasing that even further, and some of the behaviours are quite unpredictable. I won't lie, I haven't fully understood exactly how this works. There are a lot of things being changed by this. So, as you can see, it's brilliant fun to go in, play around with it, see what happens, changing all of these values. You can create all sorts of bodies out of this, and That's just without changing anything with the randomization. Let's say we changed here the climate change factor and then altered how the lowlands and valleys appeared. We can see here we've now got a planet which is half covered in oceans, half covered in desert. Using randomization and the climate change factor, or your knowledge now about how the craters look, the possibilities really are endless, and that's without having to do any coding, just some editing. Back to the templates here, we have the ocean. Now, this is a smaller moon in the stock system, covered in oceans with just some small islands. The interest in this one is not as much as previous templates. You can randomize how the islands appear. The main interest, of course, is the atmosphere and water. We'll be looking at that in the next episode when we look at parametrics. Next, the rock. This one uses a very low frequency noise to generate the irregular shape. Once again, this can be randomized by selecting that noise and clicking the dice button, or by selecting multiple elements and randomizing them all. There are also craters, which you can edit the curve of. The star, which in some ways is very similar to this lava template that we looked at a short while ago. Of course, stars are treated slightly differently in the game to other celestial bodies, and that the lighting effects are all emitted from that central body. But the actual way that the terrain or graphics are generated for the star are no different to any of the other celestial bodies in the system. We can imagine here that a higher frequency noise is used for these convection cells, and then these brighter and darker patches are produced with a lower frequency noise. The terrestrial template is undoubtedly the most complex one. It once again has a climate change factor. We won't be demonstrating that now because of time constraints, but it's great fun to go and play around with. You can change Drew from a tropical planet to an icy world. It's quite interesting. Also, there are clouds in this planet visible from great distances. You may remember that we discussed clouds very briefly in the first episode when talking about scaled space. This is a good example of how that is used. These clouds are made using a noise, but they only show up in the scaled space, or map view and great distance, loaded version of the planet. And finally, the Venusian. Now this is interesting. It mixes in the scaled space elements which are quite similar to those found in the gas giants, this banding for example, but on the ground the terrain is much more similar to the terrestrial or Martian templates. It's definitely worth exploring. And that pretty much wraps up this episode. As a summary, we looked at the fundamentals of procedural generation. That is, what is noise, what are noise seeds, what is frequency. We then briefly introduced how those appear to change in the game. We took a look at how to apply this knowledge to create unique planets through the randomization tool on the templates. Finally, we had a quick review of the templates which are available in the studio and discussed their key differences. I hope that this video was helpful. In the next episode we'll be taking a detour from our exploration of procedural generation and we'll be taking a look at parametrical editing. This will include water, atmospheres, structures and lots more. Thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed.